welcome, good afternoon or good morning, based on where you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us today for this actually 13th HUMA Book Lunch, which is a space for discussing critical work that is written by Africans on Africa about African matters. The seminar is hosted by HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa, located at the University of Cape Town. And there are several questions which we attempt to engage with here at the Institute, notably what it means to be human in Africa today. And I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Tsitsi Jaji, with whom we're going to take a different route today, because we're discussing poetry, African poetry, and centering one's body in forming or producing this kind of knowledge, and perhaps also the journeys in between. Tsitsi Jaji has given readings at the United Nations headquarters, UNESCO, and the US Library of Congress, among others. Her most recent volume of poetry, Mother Tongues, received the Cave Canem Second Book Prize and was published by Northwestern University Press in 2019. She's also the author of Beating the Graves, which we will be reading from today, and a chapbook, Carnival, which was published in 2014 and published in the first New Generation African Poets box set, both from the African Poetry Book Fund. Jaji was born and raised in Zimbabwe, and many of her poems dwell on origins, music, the sacred, and migrancy. She earns a living, or her living, as an associate professor at Duke University, and her academic book, Africa in Serial Music, Modernism, and Pan-African Solidarity, is based on research in Ghana, Senegal, and South Africa, and it actually received the African Literatures Association First Book Award and an honorable mention from the Association of Comparative Literature and Society for Ethnomusicology. Tsitsi, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours. It would really be wonderful to hear you reading one of the poems from Beating the Graves. So the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much. It's really a delight to be with all of you. University of Cape Town has been really important in my formation. I began my research for my dissertation back in 1997 at the Center for African Studies, and your much missed professor and colleague, Harry Garuba, was very dear to my heart. So I think I would like to devote my reading today to his memory, a wonderful poet and scholar and inspiring in both ways. I'm going to begin with another tribute to a poet named Patricia Jabbe Wesley from Liberia. She has taught for many years in the US at Pennsylvania State University and was one of the first African women to be pretty successfully and widely published in the US. And a lot of her poems address her navigation of the fallout of the Liberian War. She came to the US as a refugee, basically, from the war. And her poetry really is anchored in many African principles of aesthetics and beauty. So I wanted to try and praise her while staying in touch with both the oral and the written possibilities of poetry. Praise song for Patricia Jabbe Wesley. Oh yay, hey, mother poet, your father taught you to be bold. If something is true, keep doing it. Ah, you, Dr. Patricia Jabbe Wesley, you are the mother of 4 children. Mama Wesley, you have raised 4 Black human beings in this thicket called America. You, Grebo woman, you have done well. You have raised 4 human beings in this thicket of words and wordless slights. Ah, who can say you are timid? Who can say you do not know how to throw your voice into the air, and who would have pushed the air aside if not for you? Who has come to the door asking for Liberian women speak poetry? Huh? They want to know who is listening. Oh, hey, Patricia, Jabbe, Wesley, we are standing on your shadow. Forgive us, mother. We have been crowing like Johnny come latelys. Maonaka, dashika panika I ni makumbu angu, ndega. What? We are saying what? That we have arrived? Is it? But who made a shelf for us? Ay, watiritese. Who micro-braided her own hair and blocked the TV screen, a mama wata for today, hands perched on her childbearing hips? Who put the pepper pot down hard, there in the middle of the table, ready to spar joke for joke, ready to match these men? Did you hear the one about the Igbo, the Yoruba, the Hausa, and the mango tree? Oh, but what of the Yoruba, the Hausa, and the Igbo who jumped off the roof? You, Patricia, what kind of people joke about those who have died very hard? But you look death in the eye, and it looks down. You look death in the eye, and you weep. Then take off your glasses to look at us straight on. You look death in the eye, burying your sister's children and your teacher's teachers. You do the woman's part. You refuse to wail. You will not be quiet. Even we who are very, very small would like to be like you. We want to have your accent. We want to make people work hard for our words. We want our voice to have your husk. We want to inform people at the other tables who are not even eavesdropping at all, that we are not Creole, huh? We are not Creole. We want the buttons on our wool blazers to strain hard like that. We want to wear red frames like yours, that same rectangle shape. We want to take off those glasses again, to weep for joy at our young sister upstarts. We want to, like that. We want to dent the table of conversation with the struggle that is us. It is not easy. 4 books of poetry, 4 children, and an African husband? Patricia, you are your father's daughter. We thank him for teaching you to take up space, but we thank you for standing in that space. We thank you for pushing the word no so hard it fell backward. We thank you for squeezing the word man so tight it noticed it was missing 2 very important letters. We thank you for pushing the point. We are inviting you now. We are saying, Mother Patricia, teach us. We are not ready to become big women like that. We are not ready to make sure that our uncles are buried properly. We are not ready to learn how, but watching you, we just did. If something is true, keep doing it. If you knew Patricia Jabbe Wesley, you would know why she deserves praise. Yeah, so I can pause for a second there, or I can go on with a few other poems. What would you like, Amina?
We would love to have you keep going with a few other poems, and then we move on to the discussion.
Great. So as I read that one, I'm also mindful of the way that it in some ways reifies gender, in part because the fact that Patricia is an African woman in the US making her way was really inspiring to me when I first saw her in my poetry clothes. She's a scholar of African literature, but she was present at the first reading that I did with other poets published in the New Generation African Poets series. And those included Warsan Shire, TJ Dema, and another wonderful poet whose name, Ladan Osman. So, but I want to read one poem from a collection or a set called Family Trees that was in praise of my paternal aunt. In Shona culture, the name for this type of aunt can be Tete or Baba Kadzi, which literally does mean a female father. So here we go. We call that aunt a father woman. A boarding school master could snatch her branches to strip them for caning. Hunted, hers was a hard wood, mopani or mukwa, perhaps. It emerges that she is remembering a pendulated body, the rape of the royal house of Zebra, the lust fear that drove the brute away, and the winning of the land for sweet potato cultivation like it was yesterday. She plucks away at her bearded chaos. Who can count the mouths she feeds? My Tete Gladys was the one who told me the full story of my totem in Shona culture, the Mtupo that I come from, which is the zebra totem, Tembo, Marimba Kupa, and for women, Vanyemba. So I'll share a couple of the poems. This is the set that really drove my choice in a title for the collection, Beating the Graves. The term, once someone has passed away, when you've waited the appropriate period of time, which is about a year, for finishing, laying to rest, and honoring the transition of a loved one to an ancestor is called Kurowa Guva. And literally the translation is beating the graves. The Book of Vanyemba, Ex Nihilo Omnia. Each section of this has a saying from the Latin Vulgate, which is part of the Roman Catholic Mass. I neither know Latin nor the Roman Catholic Mass, but I wanted to invoke something of the sacred, but I won't preface that in the rest of these. I missed Sekuru's funeral. Only the stranger who was my aunt was left to condole. Across the oceanic hiss of telephone static, 20 years thick, Baba repeated my flight number. To get them talking again, Sekuru had died. When I arrived, she said I was her twin. I wondered, why had she not missed me? How do I bury the shame of not knowing which tree to turn after for the road, such as it is, to their land, Kumusha? We rode in the new uncle's pickup truck to the farm. Whining in the back seat about his open beer bottle, I was scared. I was scared of going Kumusha without Sekuru. Scared I would not have the words for his grave. Scared to walk his field. Scared I would forget which cows he'd given me. Scared that now he was gone, no one would gather us under the kitchen thatch to kneel and clap for protection and take snuff with the ancestors. I am right. Kneeling at his gravesite, I have no words to bring him back. Tete sits me down and tells me the story of our ancestors. She says it with a hard K. I squelch my sass and listen. Our ancestors were hunters of the zebra totem. There were 2 brothers and a very beautiful sister, as sweet as a sugar bean. So they called her Vanyemba. They came all the way from Mozambique to this place, tracking wild game. When the chief saw Vanyemba's beauty, he granted her brothers leave to hunt on his land. They set out to hunt early, leaving Vanyamba to tend the fire. She was very beautiful. The chief surprised her. She screamed, but her brothers were far, far. He was a heavy man, and he thrust himself inside her, and then he found her penis. Our Vanyamba hanged her busted bare body. When the chief saw it, he was afraid. He stripped off his regalia and fled, leaving the land to her brothers. That is the land they buried her in, and that is how we came to live in Chihuahua, the land of sweet potatoes. I am sitting next to Tete, wondering if I will ever eat a sweet potato again. I'm going to skip to another poem in the set. Come, let us eat. Gatijke. Come, let us pray. Gati rumbidze. Our grandmother, Vanyamba, we bless you. Makaita basa. Vanyamba, ambuya vedu. Grandmother, we sing your name in the fields and in the mountains. Ambuya, tino rumbidza zita renyu muminda ne mumakomo. You died for your land, but we were victorious. Praises, grandmother, high praises. Imi mafire nyika yenyu, munorumbidzwa nemupururu ambuya. Give us this day plenty of sweet potatoes. Tipe mangwanani ano, riota rakarasirira. Oh, how we rejoice to eat your sweet potatoes. Nemupururu tinoda kudya mbambaira yenyu. And how we love to eat your sugar beans. Tinopembera kudya mutakananja wa Vanyamba. For we are your great-grandchildren, raised at your breast. Tisu, tiri vazukuru zukuru venyu, yakayamwa neshishishinwa vaVanyamba. Yes, we come from the land of sweet potatoes. Mungu, kumusha kwedu de kwa Chiota. Praise be sweet sugar bean. Mupuru kwa muri Vanyamba. On the third day of the hunt, our sister. On the third day of the hunt, our sister. On the third day of the hunt, our mother who wert called hermaphrodite. On the third day, our intersex ancestor. On the third day, our intersex ancestor. Hallowed be thy name. On the third day, our intersex ancestor. How wouldst thou have wished to be called? Wouldst thou have recognized our stories, bullets in the wallet of your womb? Wouldst thou, our splendid sister, have been happier hunting as brother? Our beginning, you who were robbed of yourself, what could have comforted you, soothed your terror, eased your tender heart? What would you have wanted to hear us whisper? Your name, your truth, your home. What would have broken your search for woven vine rope? Our blessed third gender ancestor, how shall we summon you? The last one from the series. Oh, Daddy Rex, you horn-billed bronze, shake that mane, baby, flash that strobe-colored coat, dazzle us, old guinea eyes, all black and white and red all over. Let me hear you do that njenjenje, you earth rambler, you. Kick up a storm, sweetheart, kick with your mouth. You, highway robbed of you, endless gift. And I want to say about this series, not only how much it means to me to anchor myself in the idea of ancestry and the idea of nature being full of reminders of who we come from, which I think is the genius of totem systems that are associated with nature, but also that this story to me is a really important refutation of the homophobia and transphobia that has often been part of the political discourses of our of the world, but also of Africa, as if the phenomenon of non-binary identities was something foreign and something colonially imposed. We would not have these stories and these ancestors if that was true. I'll read a couple poems, just a last couple from the other book, and then we can transition to some talking, I think. And I'll just read one for now, if that's okay. And it's the title poem in some ways of the second collection, Mother Tongues. I wrote it to acknowledge the complexities of my relation to language. And the story that's told here is of the first trip that I made from Zimbabwe to the US to visit my mother's family. She's from Ohio originally. And it's also the shift that took place from Shona being the language I felt most at home in to Shona being honestly an underdeveloped and uneducated language for me, because I didn't speak it as my first home language after this particular extended visit to the US. Mother tongue. Mother of two, mixed and matched Ohio blonde, brings her brown babies, born to a brand new nation, home alone. Cash-strapped, father of two, stays behind, husbanding their shared hearth. She tames the airbound toddler boy on an elastic leash. In the airport, an unknown wasp-waist girly woman squawks in alarm, her blessedly untested parental principles. When boy won't budge, his corduroy seat sails across the waxed floors, while sister does dragging duty, a trail of gleam in their wake. That sister's bush-born vernacular follows this proven logic. With mother, speak mommy's talk. Otherwise, be at home in work. Fatherless for a spell, her tale of ups and downs and pressure and vomit in a paper bag wells up at the sight of the first matching man. Black is beautiful, powered by pride, wounded with each stop, blunted by each frisk. Black is the color of our first true love, Baba. Warm heart, beating to calm colic, nightmares, and memories flicker of something history will call Chimurenga. The language of home spills off daughter's tongue, drowning this unknown umber man whose skin is a flag of peace. His face laughs, bewilders, then unsettles in dread. White woman, panic, will bring only trouble. He harbors no desire for the body of this bronze girl child, no bribe, no candy, no white van out back. Suddenly he sees they look like family, yet he can cite no ocean to wash them apart. Mother knows best. So sorry, mother knows best. She clasps small brown hand in hers and smooths golden head of spiral hair with a free hand. She spells out a new code. Everyone here speaks only mother's tongue. Now, sister does too. End of story.
Thank you so much,
Oh,
dear Tsitsi, for showering us with your poems, but also a reading that made us travel with you back and forth. So everyone is clapping. And I think what you've mentioned towards the end, especially on this poem from Mother Tongues, and speaking of language, made me think of this question that I had written for you, and I've been really thinking about that transition of language. So I'll just read my question. I think it'll be clearer. So in the introduction, to the talk, you've written that the title "Beat in the Grave" is a literal translation of the Shona memorial ceremony, Kurova Guva. And I was pondering about your experience with language, the stepping in and out of Shona to enter an Anglo-Saxon world to speak of an experience that may not necessarily been experienced in English. So I'm thinking about that duality and whether the vantage point of diasporic renders the two experiences merged. Are they too merged to be possibly seen as two exclusive experiences? Or is the here and there, do the here and there become one when we write from a diasporic vantage point?
Yeah, thank you, Amina. It's a wonderful question. And being in conversation with you, also a chance to literally kind of think and feel through this, being on two continents. I would say that many of my poems come out of a sort of a personal anxiety, as well as fierce claiming of identity that is interpreted, but also is quite real in its duality, in that I did grow up in Zimbabwe, but my mother is from the US, and she actually went to Zimbabwe as a missionary in the 70s during Chimurenga, during the War for Liberation. So there was always a way in which I was an outsider in lots of ways. Like my hair was very strange in Nyadiri, which was the mission station that I was born in. And I learned English with an American accent instead of a Zimbabwean accent, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that I did not have a real conception of race as a collective identity. A socially constructed one, but also one which our histories make really fundamental to our political projects, right? In that I think that race is importantly malleable when one chooses various forms of solidarity or activism, whether it's during anti-apartheid and similarly in Zimbabwe, a certain move towards non-racialism, or reclamation, say, of a Pan-African identity that tends to map onto Blackness, but not necessarily, and questions about where are the edges of this Africa, and do we need edges for it? So I think that all of those things drive a certain impulse that I have to let my English be my English. And this is something, some poets look for their voice and they arrive at their voice and their style and their idiom and their sometimes long poetic investments. And for me, in some ways, I'm most interested in having anything but a single voice, because if it could be tied down to one thing, then I feel like I would have given up on the idea that language lives, right? And that forms are contingent, they're chosen, and we have the freedom, the full freedom to choose those regardless of what our other situations are. Is diaspora a place where these meld for me and for others? I'm not sure. I think about this this set of new opportunities for publishing poetry, which I would say is sort of three strands these days. In my generation, and definitely the younger generation of African poets. I was so delighted to be counted in the new generation of African poets with my gray hairs, et cetera, et cetera. But one strand of this that has been quite influential and that started with an impulse in the US, but one from people who were themselves anchored both in a childhood or parental formation in Africa, as well as their sojourns in the US, is the African Poetry Book Fund, this kind of dream child of Kwame Dawes, who has both Ghanaian and Jamaican heritage in terms of how he was raised and where and that sort of thing. And Chris Abani, the Nigerian writer, Nigerian British American writer at this point. And they had a whole junta of people, Matthew Shinoda from Egypt, and Aracelis Guillaume from Eritrea and others, right? So there, and now Philippa de Filius is one of the board members, etc. So their vision was to look for opportunities and create opportunities for writers who weren't necessarily kind of formed by primarily kind of post-colonial or anti-colonial or even kind of traditionalist as an aesthetic and political strategy, to have a place to share their work. And that, because of where they're located and some of the first poets that they published really looked like diaspora and continent, but raised anxieties about, well, what is the status of writers on the continent? And I think, you know, their first book prize, the first winner was Clifton Gachagua, Changa, who's based in Kenya. And they've consistently had contributors from around the world, but, you know, a significant number on the continent. But at the same time, the politics of publishing from the US and of publishing a lot of writers who are in diaspora, so Zambian, Canadian, or Nigerian, British, etc., raise all kinds of questions. I think those are good questions because Africa is global. I mean, our footprint is everywhere in fundamental ways, right? But many of those remain unacknowledged. And I just want to say these are at all the highest levels of commercial businesses, like what is it, Kinsey, the consulting, international consulting company. One could raise questions about, is that good or not? But, you know, James Wanyika, a Zimbabwean, led that organization, and as a result, you know, could endow a fellowship in Harvard, or the head of the WTO, all sorts of people, right? So in every sense, Africa is global. Why not in poetry as well? There's also a poetry prize that's given by the Brunel University, which actually elicited a lot of controversy among certain writers who had been disappointed that it explicitly foregrounded women at one point, or not necessarily explicitly did that as an agenda, but happened to have selected a majority of women to feature as shortlisted writers, or that selected a queer identified author as a winner of a prize, right? So their discourse around that, which I think is very warped and isn't shared widely, was that this was because it was not based on the continent, and it was sort of this imposition of Western values. Like I said from the beginning, I think that's an uninformed and not widely held position among poets, but in any case. And then there's these really exciting impulses. So presses like Jaji Press, like Kweli bringing out, you know, young writers like Tariro Ndoro, like the phenomenon that is Koleka Putuma, right? So all of these are really important energies, and one could talk about this all over the continent. Babishai poetry in Uganda, all sorts of things happening in Nigeria and elsewhere. So I would say that this question of, is the diaspora the place where these things are unified? Yes and no, or resolved, definitely no. I mean, I'm thinking about Jalada, the Kenya-based Pan-African online journal. I think it may have folded at this point, but they published a whole article on issue, a double issue on language, where they had folks translating between African languages as well as really reflecting on these things, publishing in African languages, in European languages, etc. And on some level, diaspora sometimes means continental, right? So for example, say a Nigerian author in South Africa, or a Kenyan writer translating from Zulu, et cetera, et cetera. And those internal migrations within the continent, we sometimes forget how significant those are and how long those trends have been going for. But within that big context, I do think that my perspective on language and race has been very profoundly impacted by the 28 years of my life that I've spent in the US, a place where I think these histories are fundamental and deeply suppressed as well, largely because of you know, the long history of slavery, but also lots of additional layers of migration. Yeah, long answer, I mean, sorry.
No, thank you so much. I think you brought to the fore so many perspectives and points that were much needed. So you zoomed in and out, bringing the micro and the macro, and new writing and the poetry. I would also just like to invite all the participants here to use the hand option to basically raise their hands to ask questions. But I was really curious, you know, when you mentioned the notion of global Africa, which I agree totally with, in thinking of writings by writers and poets who are in the diaspora, is, to be honest, what I find particularly magical is this perspective of a shared experience of proximity and distance to a particular space, to an ancestral land. And I was wondering if, when writing this poetry, or when this poetry came to you, you were particularly thinking about specific ways in which you would like to be read, perhaps especially by people who are not familiar with Zimbabwe, or not familiar with the particular places in Zimbabwe you refer to. So yeah, perhaps how would you like your readers to think about their own mango trees and aunts?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think I'm very selfish as a writer, in that the first and main person I'm concerned with is myself. You know, I write very often to try and think in a new way about things that pose some kind of a problem to me, like a knot or a block of some sort. But at the same time, I sometimes think of poetry as a prophecy, in that often my experience has been I've written a poem before I understand what I will need that poem to do, or before, and then it will seem like a you know, a gift from wherever, from the flexibility of time into wherever I find myself. At the same time, yes, of course, one has to think about how they want to be read. I'll say really honestly, to get a publisher, you have to think about this, right? And so I would say that even though there are fantastic presses, small presses in Zimbabwe, you know, I remember speaking with Irene Staunton, a heroic editor of Weaver Press in Zimbabwe, about the possibility of publishing poetry. And she very rightly said there's no market for it in Zim, which was not to say that there weren't people who love poetry and are fantastic poets. But when you have a situation where a book costs potentially the equivalent of a month's salary, is somebody going to spend that on a poetry book by a single author, or on an anthology, for example? Are they going to spend it on an inspirational, you know, devotional kind of book, which I can kind of like look down on from the privilege of being able to have all these books behind me, you know, which it really is a function of the privilege of being in the US academia with all of its resources. or are they going to buy a book of poetry? So then it meant that I'm writing, literally I was writing for the Silliman First Book Prize, which is the opportunity that the African Poetry Book Fund has opened for people. Is you can enter your manuscript into this prize, but only one person wins the prize, right? Which was Clifton, and he deeply deserved it, you know. And the best thing that happens many times in one's life is to come in second. At least in my life, I say that I've specialized in being second best. And what happened was that the collection drew the attention of the editors of African Poetry Book Fund, and then they reached out to me and said, you know, if you want to, you know, fix the manuscript a bit, we're interested in it. At that point, you know, you're writing for what the editors ask you for. I was writing for what I assumed was a publisher who wanted me to sound African, you know, whatever that means. I mean, I wondered, for example, and I'm very grateful that they included it, about the chunk of this book called Carnival. I studied music as a child and into my first degree in college. I studied classical piano. I did the Royal School College of Music exams, and they would ship out a person every year to listen to everybody studying piano from Britain, and that person would write, you know, have you learned your scales properly, et cetera, et cetera. So I did it for many, many years. And I love this music. And so Carnival is the name of a series of musical works by Robert Schumann, a German 19th century poet. And when I had to give the concert to graduate from university, I played these 24 pieces and I wrote program notes. But the program notes were poems for each one of these 24 pieces. But they're about, you know, like, well, one of them is called Eusebius. This was the name that Schumann, who suffered from bipolar disorder, which is actually a illness that I live with, or condition, or way of moving through the world, which is why he appealed to me. He called his depressed self Eusebius. Now, when the noble, brilliant writer I'm going to mess up his name. Parks, the writer Parks, excellent Ghanaian writer, set out to write the introduction to the chapbook these appeared in first. He said Eusebius was like a pope from the 4th century. Because he Googled or whatever. And no. He was this, you know, this character in this 19th century German pianist thing. So and he graciously changed it, et cetera, et cetera. But the point there is that some poems I was writing for myself without thinking about where do they go in the world. And it's so nice to be able to do readings, especially ones where I feel so welcomed as here, so that I can sort of put a context around a poem. But I also, when I was writing it, I was thinking about one of the things that hit me the most, which was a statement by Abdullah Ibrahim, the amazing South African pianist, that the piano is an African instrument. Well, it was first made of ivory and ebony. I don't know where they found ivory in Germany or wherever they were building it, right? So materially, it's this bearer of a colonial history and expropriation, but also it is materially African, and it's a percussion instrument, you know. So in any case, all of those things help me to think about how do I shape my poems to speak to the people that I care about being recognized by. Because that's what really matters to me, is to find a set of readers who can recognize me and recognize what I care about, and can then write kind of back to it, even in friction, or, you know, in whatever way. And one of the things that means the most to me in the Facebook world is that every once in a while, you know, younger poets from other parts of the continent will say, oh, I love this poem, it's so, you know, whatever. And it's really special. but you know, I often am writing for multiple audiences too, so I'll bury all kinds of references to various things in a poem. And a poem book is a collection of however many, maybe 80, 90 pages. And so it makes a new audience. It makes an audience that includes folks who know who Wanyemba is and who are also Mtupo zebras, but also an audience that is, you know, Nigerian and British and whatever. And those people would never talk to each other perhaps, but they are thinking with me and then maybe thinking outwards from there. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tsitsi. I have so many questions, but I think I'll hand it over to Mimi to ask her question next.
Thank you, Tsitsi, for your presentation, which I find very, very inspiring. I really like poetry. When I was younger, I used to write a lot of poetry, but I stopped when I got to first year at university, and I just haven't done anything, which is embarrassing. But I think this is really inspiring for me to try again and open like my old book of poems and revise. Mm-hmm. And for me, what I sense from your listening to what you're saying is, well, for me, it reads like some nostalgia, because sometimes I feel nostalgic. I'm Zimbabwean myself, by the way.
But so sorry to interrupt, but Gloria Sipiwe, Gloria Ndlovu, has a mini in her first book, Theory of Flight. You'll have to read it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, but I grew up in Matabeleland, so I didn't speak Shona. Of course, I studied Shona in high school, but I didn't speak it at home. But there are many things I feel nostalgic about when I look at your work and listen to you. A lot of things linguistically that I otherwise can't speak about with my non-African friends. And I also feel your poetry allows, I think, diasporic Africans to access some remnants of home. And also, I kind of feel nostalgic, and not even just nostalgia, but a sense of a huge gap in my own culture, because I had a very Western upbringing, very, very Western. It's like my parents intentionally wanted me to be devoid from Africanism. You know, I went to I was trained in classical singing. I didn't learn how to play an instrument, but I didn't know a lot of traditional rituals. I went to a Christian school, and there's so many things that I feel like I wish I had learned about my heritage, which my parents otherwise didn't expose that to me. So I think poetry is a good source of conveying so many stories and lessons that were otherwise missed. At least from me, that's what I get a sense of. And I'm just wondering whether you know how to play the mbira, because it's very similar to the piano. And I think, isn't that where they stole the idea from anyway? The piano?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about who gets what when, but I definitely think that mbira music, you know, in terms of the complexity of its harmonic structures and polyphony, you know, all of these lines are going at the same time. You know, it has all sorts of, let's say, relationships to say the piano. Yeah. And you know, like the colonial name in some ways for it is the tam piano.
Yeah.
Which is, it's also a metaphor, right? We can see that as well in this. I don't play mbira. I studied it at the very end of secondary school. I went to Arundel, so my dear, I can understand what you're saying, you know, about this very Western upbringing, right? And I've never been to a ceremony of Kuruba Gua or to a bira, right? even though these are the things that I write about in my poems, to be able to imagine and translate what I understand as the principles of those, but written into them is precisely this this lacunae, right? Which is, I think, where the sitting down with my aunt, that was the first time, age 25, to hear this story of Anyemba, right? Even though I knew that all the men in my family, including my dad, were Majimba Kupa, which is the male version of that. I do also want to say that one of the things that I think is so important and that literature can do is to unsettle this Shona centricism in Zimbabwe. And I actually recently wrote an article called The Bulawayo Novel about the fact that if you take a specific small space as the center of your literary analysis, rather than the national or, you know, the transnational, etc., you learn something really important about the construction of collective identities and nation, but also about that place, right? To insist that one has to understand more about Matabeleland or about Bulawayo, wherever it is, right? In order to understand the world first, you know, let alone one's nation identity and all those things. So this question of nostalgia is really important. And I think I hope you return to poetry writing, because what you're talking about in the sense of it offering a different medium and terms of engagement, I would even say, right? A space in which the speculative can take up an important role seems very unique, right? It's not narrative. Narrative is precisely the thing where we have to know exactly what happened and the details and all that sort of thing to conjure a world. In many ways, poetry's spareness and its spaces and its attention, its pace, right, gives us license, I think, to engage with these gaps and to find their truth, because you and I are not the only ones who've had this experience. This is very, very common. Tarirondoro's collection, which has a great title, I can't remember the title, Agringada, it's something like that. But she writes in this collection, another young Zimbabwean poet, about feeling alienated from language, in her case, having gone to the convent in Harare, and her relation to her grandmother about not speaking the vernacular, and the ways in which, you know, being Black at what still was a, you know, white dominated school, mostly white nuns, but also more importantly, a kind of European set of values, entailed this constant questioning and in some ways denigration of heritage. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you so much, Tsitsi. I saw so many hands, but I don't see them anymore. Abunga, you had a question, please go ahead. I'm afraid you're muted, if you could mute.
I'm sorry about that. I had a lot of questions, but I think some of them were actually answered as you were talking. I really enjoyed the poems. I think from the musical perspective, I had a question which seemed to have been answered, because I wanted to know how important it is for you to incorporate music into your poems. But I mean, with all the background from Schumann in the 19th century up until now, I think you managed to answer that question. Also in the book that you wrote, Music, Modernism and Pan-African Solidarity, that was based on research in South Africa. Probably then you have a perspective of how music is structured in South Africa. How can we actually make sure that it's something that is regarded as something that's important in relation to the society? Yeah.
Well, you know, thanks for asking about that project. What I included about South Africa in it was the kind of first body chapter, which was on Solomon Plaatje, John Dube, Nkutela Dube, and Charlotte was that these were all musicians.
Mm.
We remember them as political figures, but Charlotte traveled to Britain and eventually to the US, where she encountered the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and then wrote to her uncle, who was really instrumental in establishing that denomination in South Africa, as a member of a choir. A touring
African choir, yes.
Right, exactly. And you know, that Nokutela and John Lube wrote a book of Zulu songs that they wanted to have, you know, central in their form of forming a school, right? So all of these ways in which they believed that music was fundamental. They believed that having some kind of notated but open to improvisation, I'm sure you know these things, right? A collection of contemporary Zulu songs was fundamental to a kind of liberationist education. And these are the same people who were founding what became the ANC. You know, for better and for worse, it was really fundamental to the formation of a national project and identity, etc. So I think that there's some gaps sometimes in terms of how we understand what's important and what isn't, and that across the world these days there's this crisis in terms of the obsession with science and technology, as if these things were going to liberate us. But unless we understand our values, and unless we have the access to what you know, Minnie was raising in terms of the complex aesthetics and polyphony in Mbira music, or the flexibility, say, of the single string harp in South Africa, what have you, of the choir tradition, right? Of these incredible singing, collective singing traditions that predate, but also have reinterpreted, say, European musics, etc., then we're really losing out on very fundamental epistemologies, I would say, and the framework in which to understand balance, for example, right? You know better than I about choral singing and everything that you learn about unison, about listening to each other, about patience, about rehearsal, all of those things.
Teamwork, discipline, all these things.
Exactly. Yeah. So thanks for that. I think that's really important.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Amina.
Thank you, Abunga. Next, I would like to invite Sanya to ask his question.
Thank you very much, Amina. Mine is not actually a question, it's a comment. I wanted to make a few remarks about your aesthetic practice, I like how you perform your poetry, how you talk, and then how you perform, slightly different, which is quite endearing. And I like the sense of appreciation you have of older African aesthetic, you know, traditions, or what the role of an artist in you know, in ancient Africa. I think it seeps into your work, and I don't know whether it's consciously, because you speak, I mean, there are Shona phrases in your poetry, and then the fact of paying homage, which is a very, very central motif in African poetry, you know, older African poetry. You know, paying homage to the great, the Liberian academic in the US who brought up 4 kids and, you know, lived a very purposeful, meaningful life, not to just herself, but her people and her community. And then your paternal aunt, and then the appreciation of nature, the totemic animals that, you know, bear so much importance to African lives in terms of names, you know, the lion, the zebra, and what have you. All these are very deeply embedded in African aesthetic practices and traditions. And so it's a question of not only maintaining a link within ancestral practices, but channeling those into the present and the future. And that's a very important role of an artist, which I found in your work. I like that aspect, which, it came out very strongly. And it's from the poems you read to us. So I just wanted to comment on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sonia. It means a lot to me. And, I did grow up, I was born like in the sticks, I mean, you can't really find Yajiri on a map. When I tell people where I'm from, I just sort of round up to Morewa area, but or Uzumba, but it's from a small place, Chitimbe, that my family's from. So it's not that I grew up there. We moved to Harare before independence and that sort of thing. But one grows up with what in Zimbabwe we call tsika, just like a sense of, proper manners. And probably this was more the case for my generation, right? We're not quite the born frees. I was born during the 70s, but so in a lot of ways, we didn't live through, say, the crisis of AIDS or the post-ESAP economy, or even the post 2000 economy, or the incomplete project of redistribution of land, all those things. So I feel like I experienced this very special moment of cultural transition and values that I am only recognizing now as this amazing resource. But I also think that sense of loss, the nostalgia that many of us feel as we're so deeply anchored in like historically Western knowledge formations, regardless of how much we're decolonizing them, we're aware of that gap, and therefore I may be called to this kind of work. For some of us, everybody does different things, but I really appreciate your seeing that and explaining it in this way.
Thank you so much, Tsitsi, and thank you, Sanya. I just want to acknowledge that we've passed for the 5 p.m. CST threshold. So thank you for everyone who's still here with us. I have a question, Tsitsi, that I would feel sad if I didn't ask it. But it's really a question about, how do we write about that which we don't know? You've mentioned how poems come from elsewhere, and then we spend so much time either passively or actively trying to decode what they mean. And I was wondering about, this process of trace lineages that we've often distanced ourselves from. How does one have to move his or her or their bodies in order to make sense of the poem, or do we stand still and wait for that interpretation to come through?
I love your questions. I mean, you say these things where you're like, do we do this or do we do that? And both of them are true. They're both true, so I think that there's like the body and then there's the being, right? So that one doesn't have to move one's body to be kind of circulating one's being. And that's where I think the arts are actually quite powerful, right? In that one can be in one's imagination in the land of Kintu, for example, by Jennifer Kumbi. I hope I'm getting it right. Or in the world of Grain of Wheat by Ngugi, right? So that one can travel back in time, one can travel with speculative fiction. And I think maybe that's why African science fiction and science fiction more broadly, maybe it has come to a new fore, in that that's one of the obvious ways one can experience traveling into another world, right? But also it's definitely true that when one moves one's body, one has some kind of distance from wherever home is. And that might be just a walk, you know, oftentimes the beginnings of poems come to me as I see something, and then that's that thing, or I've been around something. So for example, like the totem, Tembo also venerates bees. I'm really scared of bees, all right? My brother was once stung by a swarm and had a serious health complication as a result. But then they're also supposed to be this way in which the past speaks to me that, again, I didn't know until later on in life. And then I'm the one who's read, you know, about like all of this story of Wanyamba. I have like 6 or 7 little files of various parts of the history. So I would say that, you know, again, it's not necessarily moving one's body, but it's moving into an area of not knowing. And maybe that's the great thing about our lives in academia, is that this habit of learning more about precisely what one doesn't know is maybe a way of conducting one's thinking that also enriches the poetry. So that was the kind of the one version of how one does things. And then the other one that you were describing, I'm not so clearly remembering. But yeah.
Yeah, I think I was hesitant about whether we just need to stand still. I think you really responded to it. Yeah. Maybe you could elaborate further.
Yeah, I mean, every poem is different. Every occasion of writing is different. And there, for me, poems that are very much influenced or connected to nature are often still poems. I really love being outside. My husband does not, and he's like, oh, you know, concrete and an urban bird, that's also nature. You know, it's true. But for me, I really find something calming and therefore stilling for myself about being outdoors. And then I think I'm more receptive to thinking more loosely. I think of poetry as kind of loosening my my relation to language. Especially, I'm sure you can identify as academics, we have to exactly tie down exactly what we mean, and, you know, talk about the counter arguments and this sort of thing. And it's a wonderful discipline, but it's a discipline, you know. And I feel like poetry is a place and a set of possibilities that one may discipline. You know, one may decide they're really interested in a certain formal structure or what have you, or even the very discipline of writing regularly. And I do want to say, to me, I've had years when I haven't written, like extended periods of years when I haven't written poetry, and, you know, it happens. The same with practicing, but I just come back to it, and each time I'm different. I could say worse and worse, but it's just different, you know. And I think that's something, as I've gotten older, that I kind of trust more, is that things change, the habits change, what works changes. And our most inspiring thinkers, who we tend to tie down as if it was one idea, had a lot of ideas, changed their minds, you know, had an evolution in thought. So I hope that we do as poets too. And so it's not necessarily moving one's body, but one's body changes and one's modes of experience and observation and experience of time changes as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Tsitsi. That was really profound, and it hit deeply, and something I'll definitely be thinking along with. I'm not trying to be selfish, but I'm just curious. And I'm curious about the process of revisiting a poem, right? What happens when you revisit a poem? Is it kind of an alteration from its initial birth? And what is the process of revisiting a poem because I think it's something you've mentioned in one of the interviews you've done on the poems in Beating the Graves towards the ones that you described or characterized as heavy, and which you situated, I think, towards the end of the book.
Yeah.
I was just curious about that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm a little anxious about what I can publish from here on out because I've recycled most of my old poems. I don't have many like left old ones. Although what I will say is that one accumulates what at the time are unrealized, let's say, poems, which one then comes back to at moments of I don't know, for any number of reasons. And both books have a lot of poems that are quite old. You know, I would say one thing that changes for me is the context of them. So, for example, most of the poems for Carnival are quite similar to how they started, and in some cases completely unchanged. But over time, for example, I moved away from the habit of capitalizing the first letter of every line. Kwame Dawes made a comment to me that was a rather old-fashioned way of thinking about line, and it occurred to me that when I read and when I hear in my ear the language, I want oftentimes for the thought to continue, even if something about what looks visual on the page or what's emphasized in terms of an idea or sound by the break is also important to me. So one thing I would say is that over time one learns or becomes interested in or encounters new ideas about writing. And then one wants to, one feels more comfortable including those or likes those better. And honestly, I think liking is a big part of writing. Like we feel happy when we get to some point where we're like, okay, this is it, and that's the stopping point, and it may remain the stopping point or not. There's some poets I know who have done this a lot and who I really like this phenomenon of coming back to a poem or to a story. Edward Clisson in his fiction comes and tells the story of the same characters at different points of their lives, and it's not necessarily a saga. Comes meaning his work lives on even though he sadly has passed away. But this idea that one can return to something is really cool to me. So in Beating the Graves, like almost everything in Carnival is the same, but one of the poems that really changed was the poem Florestan, which is the opposite of Eusebius, and it's like the sort of manic side of Schumann's experience. And in this version, in a context where the family trees and Carnival and all this sort of thing is foregrounding for me Africa, it became a poem about and for Fela Kuti, right? And I didn't want to give the whole thing away, so I call it Florestan, aka Anikulapo, which was kind of his middle name, and then it ends with Kalakuta, his Kalakuta Republic. And it wasn't there in the first version in the same way, but the sense of racing was there in the first way. And then it had become important to my imagination that one of the examples of this kind of excess that's very powerful and an ultimate confrontation of power and restriction, which is what had been in the first version, was Kuti, And then there's poems in mother tongues. Some of them, like there was one poem that I'd written about being ill with a condition called Graves' disease. I always talk about these illnesses so that if somebody has them, then they hear about it. And if it's stigmatized, then you know, that at least you're in good company with one other strange person with the same stigma. But anyways, I had this condition, which was a thyroid condition, overactive thyroid, and it had to be treated with a certain kind of radioactive iodine. So I'd written about that, but I hadn't written about all the fallout in terms of family relations, in terms of my own education being interrupted, all these kinds of things. But I had come to a point 15, 20 years after that experience where I had a different affective and emotional relation to it, and where I had distance from which I could speak back to some of the hurts of that moment, and also see them as part of and make them part of a different dynamic living thing. So for me, when I return to a poem, I'm returning to a time and place I'm no longer enmeshed in, and therefore new, not even possibilities, but new conditions condition the poem and condition my writing. And in all the senses of that, maybe in terms of strengthening, muscle training, all that kind of thing, in terms of the context, in terms of what my deal with the world or with my reader is. I'll do this on condition that you do that, you know. And oftentimes the condition is recognition and a sense of, okay, that was how you saw it and how you say it, and it's yours in that version. Yeah.
Thank you so much, dear Tsitsi. I love what you said. New conditions condition the writing, and the condition is recognition. I'll definitely be thinking a lot with this for this next phase. And I think you've granted us, I think you've granted everyone here today I would say the courage. Let me not speak on behalf of everyone. Let me step back. I think you've granted me the courage to also go back to thinking about writing poetry, just like what Mimi said. And I think it's important to think about it as a valid form of archiving history and of archiving one's existence, and also of moving away from the assumption of the able-bodied that navigates the world, because I think that chokes a lot of us when we're in spaces where people don't recognize that our bodies are not conditioned in the same ways, or are not functioning in the same ways other bodies are. Yeah, I just have a lot of gratitude, Tsitsi. Thank you for helping us create a space in which we're really able to connect back to tracing history through poetry, and also understanding that poems are transcendental. And I think listening to how you perform poetry, as Sanya said, was also a different kind of experience. So thank you so much for inspiring us.
Oh, thank you. It feels so great, I have to say, to interrupt you, as a poet and a writer and a, you know, fellow thinker with you guys, to be able to have you excavate these elements of what is there, you know, because I don't know these as well until we talk about them and until you ask a question like that. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I truly hope we can have you back at some point during the year to, I think, have a conversation on African musical epistemologies. I think that was quite also central in our conversation today, and something that we must also think about more deeply. I think Abonga and
I would love to learn from Abonga about that. Yeah.
Please, everyone, do join us next week. We have another Huma book launch, same time as today, and we will be hosting Badgerun Gabeba and Desiree Lewis. I think you work closely with Badgerun because I saw her name on
Yeah. Habiba is a dear friend and a wonderful poet. I'm so glad you guys get to spend time with her. Yeah.
Yes, so please do join us next week if you can. We'll be talking about surfacing on being Black and feminist in South Africa, which is a very recent edited volume that was, I think it just got published this year. So I think it hosts a lot of different authors from South Africa as well. But Tsitsi, thank you so much for your time and your generosity and sharing. It's really been a pleasure and an honor to host you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye, good people.